Welcome to today's deep dive. We are really excited to have you with us today.
Yeah, we have a pretty mind-bending topic to get into.
We really do. Our mission today is unpacking something so pervasive that it basically forms the background noise of your entire daily existence.
It is the one thing you literally cannot escape.
Exactly. We are talking about the mechanics of your inner voice.
Yeah.
We're going to deconstruct what is actually happening during that constant, that internal monologue playing out in your head.
Right. And to do this, we're looking at a really fascinating translated philosophical manuscript on the nature of consciousness.
Along with a few modern commentaries to help us contextualize it all for you.
Because the primary source text drops a massive paradigm shift right in its opening pages.
It really does. Because, we always hear that phrase, listen to your soul in pop culture.
Oh yeah, all the time.
And it carries this assumption that the deepest, quietest voice inside of us is our core essence giving us directions, like an inner compass.
But this manuscript argues something completely different. It posits that the pure soul is fundamentally complete.
Right.
It is entirely motionless. And most importantly, it is completely silent.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah, in this philosophical framework, the pure soul lacks the friction required for deliberation. It doesn't have doubts, it doesn't formulate questions.
Because it operates in a state of absolute unperturbed stillness.
Exactly. When an entity is entirely self-sufficient, the mechanisms of internal debate are just structurally unnecessary.
But that sets up a huge mystery for anyone examining their own head.
A really big one.
Because if our truest, deepest essence is totally silent and has no need for language, then who on earth is talking in our heads?
Right, who is generating all that noise?
Someone is constantly in there arguing with us about risk, or analyzing past interactions, or just debating mundane daily choices. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the text provides a very specific framework to resolve this. The dialogue you hear is not the pure soul expressing itself.
Not at all.
It is framed as an ongoing dynamic negotiation between two distinct elements. The Jeevatma, which translates to the embodied soul and the mind.
So the inner voice is actually the byproduct of a relationship.
Exactly. It is an embodied entity actively interfacing with its own cognitive instrument.
Which means we need to do a deep dive into the concept of dualism as the manuscript defines it.
Because operating purely within a state of absolute consciousness means a dialogue is literally impossible.
Right, because non-dualism lacks another. There is no one to talk to.
The problem of pure consciousness when you are trying to find an inner monologue is its singular nature. A conversation inherently demands a duality.
A sender and a receiver.
Yes. So the text explains that the Jeevatma is born the exact moment that boundless pure consciousness associates itself with a physical form and an intellect.
It is the localization of the infinite into a finite vessel. It creates a specific, localized perspective.
And that resulting dualism is defined using very specific terminology in the commentaries.
The Jeevatma assumes the role of the knower, or the Gyata in Sanskrit.
Right, the locus of awareness.
And the mind, conversely, is categorized as the known, or the Gyai.
The commentaries really go out of their way to distinguish the locus of awareness from the instrument of perception.
Like distinguishing a scientist from the microscope they are using.
Exactly. The mind is entirely instrumental in this view. It processes the external environment, it synthesizes data, and it generates thoughts.
But it is not the observer itself.
No, it isn't. And this inherent separation between the knower and the known is what generates that cognitive friction we experience as an internal monologue.
So the chatter isn't a glitch in the system.
Not at all. It is a highly motivated process. The text attributes this internal back and forth to the efforts of a mumukshu.
Which is a term from the text referring to an individual possessing an intense driving desire for liberation or moksha.
The internal dialogue is the Jeevatma actively attempting to discipline and calibrate its own inner being. It is the knower trying to optimize its instrument.
Trying to get the mind to behave, basically.
Right, because the mumukshu recognizes that the mind left to its default evolutionary programming will constantly attach itself to external stimuli.
So the internal chatter is essentially a corrective feedback loop, an effort to align the mind's operations with the ultimate goal of philosophical freedom.
Exactly.
But that corrective feedback loop often feels like a massive struggle.
Oh, absolutely it does.
I mean, think about how often you sit down to engage in deep work, or you attempt to maintain focus on a complex task.
And you try to logically mandate your attention.
Yes, you try to leverage rational commands, ordering your brain to stay on task, and it almost universally fails.
The attention fractures. It drifts toward unrelated memories or immediate biological drives.
Brute forcing the mind with logic is incredibly ineffective.
And the source material is quite explicit about the limitations of that purely rational approach. The Jeevatma cannot successfully command the mind using logic alone.
Because the mind's fundamental attachments are not rational.
Right, they are driven by a deeply ingrained reward-seeking architecture. But what's fascinating here is the strategy the text actually prescribes to fix this.
It is not a frontal assault.
No, the Jeevatma has to utilize a form of sophisticated persuasion. Rather than fighting the mind's tendency to seek pleasure, it tempts the mind with the promise of a higher joy.
It essentially leverages the mind's own mechanics against it.
Yes. The commentaries equate the mind's outward orientation to something resembling the hedonic treadmill.
It constantly scans the external environment for happiness, seeking dopamine through status or material acquisition or sensory inputs.
But the inherent flaw in that outward orientation is the principle of impermanence.
Right, because all external objects and experiences are subject to degradation and change.
Because the stimuli are temporary, the psychological reliance on them inevitably results in sorrow, or at least a return to a baseline state of dissatisfaction.
You always end up wanting more.
Exactly. Now, the Jeevatma, possessing the broader awareness of the knower, recognizes this cycle.
So it acts as a guide. It systematically demonstrates to the mind that the external pursuit is a zero-sum game.
It is a process of re-educating the cognitive instrument. The Jeevatma effectively points out the diminishing returns of external attachments.
And offers an alternative inward focus that promises an unshakable lasting peace.
This realization is the critical pivot point. The greatest assurance the Jeevatma can offer the mind is the empirical observation that external joys inherently bring eventual sorrow.
And when the mind genuinely comprehends the superior value of this inward higher joy, the resistance just collapses.
It willingly turns its attention inward, bypassing the need for logical submission.
Because the internal reward is perceived as immensely greater than any external stimulus.
Which introduces a profound paradigm shift regarding self-discipline. We so often frame discipline as a punitive restriction of the mind.
Like tying it down.
Right, but the manuscript frames it as an offering of a superior alternative.
Which naturally leads into the text's examination of meditation. It presents a paradox that really challenges our baseline assumptions.
It is a great question.
When you sit down in a meditative posture and attempt to stabilize your focus, the text forces you to ask, who is the entity actually performing the meditation?
And it uses a phenomenal process of elimination to uncover the true subject of the meditative act.
Starting with a pure soul.
Right, that ultimate silent consciousness we discussed initially. The text concludes that it does not meditate.
Because a state of absolute perfection and liberation requires no practice.
It lacks the deficiency that would necessitate an action to improve or alter its state. It is already perfect.
And the physical apparatus is equally disqualified. The biological matter, the neural pathways, the physiological structure, it is all inert without consciousness.
It is just a biological machine. It is completely incapable of engaging in philosophical self-reflection or desiring liberation on its own.
Which leaves only one option.
The Jeevatma. It is the sole candidate. The Jeevatma engages in meditation specifically because it operates under the illusion of incompleteness.
Because as the embodied soul, it represents consciousness that has temporarily identified with a limited framework.
Exactly. Meditation is the methodology it uses to bridge the perceived gap between its localized, limited experience and its true, boundless nature.
The text outlines the mechanics of this process through a specific phase of spiritual practice called sadhana.
And it heavily emphasizes the adoption of a witness attitude, or sakshi.
The sakshi state, which represents a radical shift in cognitive distancing.
Instead of the Jeevatma entangling itself in the narrative content of the thoughts, it establishes a detached observation.
It adopts the stance of the knower observing the known.
It watches the mind construct desires, anxieties, and memories without claiming ownership of them.
It is akin to developing a metacognitive awareness. You observe your mental processes as phenomena occurring within your field of awareness, rather than identifying as the phenomena themselves.
You are watching the movie instead of believing you were in it.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The manuscript asserts that this internal dialogue, and even the deliberate practice of observing the mind, has a definitive expiration date.
Yes, it doesn't go on forever.
The practice of sakshi only continues until a very specific realization occurs. The Jeevatma recognizes that the mind it has been actively observing and attempting to discipline is fundamentally an extension of its own consciousness.
The duality collapses in that exact moment of recognition. The mind ceases to be an external antagonist or a separate instrument.
It is recognized as a projection created by consciousness to interface with the temporal world.
When the Jeevatma perceives the mind not as a separate entity to be controlled, but as a direct extension of its own being, the friction that generated the internal dialogue evaporates.
The knower and the known recognize their underlying unity.
And that realization completely neutralizes the conflict.
Right, because if you are struggling against an adversarial force, only to realize you are wrestling with a projection of your own, making the struggle instantly terminate.
You drop the rope.
Exactly. And this marks the transition into the final stage of the journey outlined in the modern commentaries.
As the Jeevatma integrates this realization and aligns closer with its true unconditioned nature, the mind begins to undergo a process of dissolution.
But the text is careful to note this isn't a violent destruction of your cognitive faculties.
No, not at all. It is a natural fading away of an instrument that has simply outlived its utility.
And the cessation of the mind inevitably brings about the end of the dialogue.
The negotiation, the temptation toward higher joy, the deliberate witnessing all of it just stops.
The state that follows is described as devoid of form and shape.
The manuscript refers to this resulting state as absolute zero consciousness.
Absolute zero.
Yes, but we must be careful not to conflate the zero with a nihilistic void or mere emptiness.
It is not nothingness.
Right, it is zero in the thermodynamic sense of absolute stillness. The baseline reality before any fluctuations, dualities, or thought constructs emerge.
The text posits that the experience of actual ultimate truth begins precisely where the dialogue ends.
Because the fundamental reality of existence cannot be accessed through cognitive deliberation.
The limitations of language and thought are absolute in this context.
They can only take you so far.
To synthesize these concepts, the commentaries utilize a deeply resonant, overarching metaphor, the me and my shadow dynamic.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that metaphor distills the entire philosophical architecture we have been discussing.
It brings it all together.
The shadow is the analog for the mind, and the me represents the pure, unconditioned light of consciousness.
The text suggests that the entirety of your internal dialogue, all that rigorous process of disciplining and negotiating with your mind, is predicated entirely on your identification with the limited physical form.
As long as you believe you are the object casting the shadow, your attention will be inextricably bound to the shadow's movements.
But a shadow is fundamentally contingent on an object obstructing a light source. So the moment awareness shifts from the obstructing object to the light itself, when the Jeevatma recognizes its identity as the boundless light of consciousness rather than the physical vessel, the conditions for the shadow disappear.
The internal chatter, the egoic construct in the mind, dissolve entirely into the light.
Pure, unobstructed light casts no shadow.
The internal dialogue served a distinct and necessary purpose to guide the localized, limited sense of self back to the recognition of its limitless source.
And once that recognition is achieved, the utilitarian function of the mind is complete.
And the inherent silence of the pure soul reasserts itself as the primary state of being.
So what does this all mean for you navigating the complexities of your own internal landscape?
It changes everything about how you view your thoughts.
It does. When you find yourself overwhelmed by cognitive friction or frustrated by your inability to rein in a wandering focus, you can reframe the experience.
That internal noise is not a failure of discipline.
No, it is the Jeevatma. It is your localized consciousness engaging in the necessary intricate work of guiding its cognitive instrument away from fleeting external attachments and toward a profound, lasting internal equilibrium.
It is a feature of the system, an essential mechanism of a much deeper philosophical journey.
It really is a beautiful way to look at our own struggles with focus and inner peace.
It is. But this profound framework does leave us with a very compelling philosophical implication to consider regarding the ultimate destination of this practice.
What do you mean?
Well, if the trajectory of this spiritual discipline leads toward absolute zero consciousness, a state where the mind, the internal narrative, and all cognitive dualities completely dissolve into a silent, unperturbed reality, we really have to consider the fate of our individuated identity.
Our personality.
Right. What becomes of our specific quirks, our intellectual preferences, and our unique sense of humor? It raises the question of whether achieving true silent enlightenment necessitates the total surrender of the distinct, colorful human personality that initiated the search for meaning in the very first place.
That is a phenomenal question to leave off on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the architecture of the mind and the silent depths of consciousness. Keep questioning the nature of your own experiences. Keep exploring the frameworks that define our reality, and pay a little more attention to distinct voices participating in your next internal debate. We will catch you next time.